At 9:37 local time, the morning heat was already pressing down on Iran's southern coastline, the air thick with salt and fuel, the horizon shimmering above the waters of the Persian Gulf. Inside the sprawling naval base at Bandar Abbas, the frigate Sahand rested quietly alongside a dozen other vessels, steel hulls lined in rigid formation. As crews moved with rehearsed urgency, orders had been given. The Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical maritime choke points on the planet, was about to be contested. What none of them knew was that the decision had already been made. Hundreds of miles away, aboard silent silhouettes cutting through the Gulf of Oman and the Persian Gulf, U.S. Navy destroyers and submarines had finished their calculations hours earlier, coordinates locked, routes plotted, timing synchronized down to the second. Then, without warning, the silence shattered. Tomahawk cruise missiles erupted into the morning sky in rapid succession, each launch a controlled explosion of fire and force. One after another, they streaked low over the water, skimming at barely 30 feet above the surface, invisible to most radar systems, threading their way through the dense traffic of early morning shipping lanes. Each missile followed a path designed the night before, precise corridors carved through open water, buffered by thousands of yards to avoid civilian vessels. 12 miles from the Iranian coastline, the missiles crossed into land-following mode. Their onboard systems shifted seamlessly. Tercom terrain contour matching came alive. Radar altimeters began reading the shape of the Earth below, comparing hills and valleys against stored elevation maps. Within seconds, each missile knew exactly where it was. It was like driving blind through fog, and suddenly recognizing a road you'd memorized years ago. Back at Bandar Abbas, the Sahand's combat systems were just coming online. Inside the Combat Information Center, dimly lit consoles flickered to life. The Noor anti-ship missile systems were powering up. 4 minutes to full readiness. Maybe 3 if the crew skipped critical checks. But time was no longer theirs. Far offshore, inside the Combat Information Center of a U.S. destroyer, the tactical action officer stood motionless, eyes locked on a live MQ-9 drone feed. The image showed the harbor in crisp detail, the stillness before impact. 2 minutes, someone whispered. There was nothing left to do but watch. At 9:55, the first Tomahawk arrived. The screen flashed white, pure, blinding light, followed by a violent bloom of fire that swallowed the Sahand's pier in an instant. When the image stabilized, black smoke was already rolling across the harbor, thick and oily, climbing into the sky faster than the morning wind could carry it eastward. Secondary explosions followed ammunition cooking off in chaotic succession. The Noor launchers never fired. The clock, however, kept ticking. A second Tomahawk was already inbound, its DSMAC seeker active. Unlike its predecessor, this missile needed to see. Its nose-mounted camera scanned the terrain ahead, comparing real-time imagery to stored satellite photographs. It was searching for a match, the Sabalan's pier, like facial recognition, but for destruction. The problem was the smoke. DSMAC required clarity, clean lines, recognizable shapes, but the harbor was no longer what it had been minutes ago. Flames twisted through the wreckage. The once clear geometry of ships and piers had dissolved into chaos. If the system failed to match its intended target, it would select the next closest visual pattern. And in that moment, burning debris could look a lot like a ship still waiting to be struck. On the MQ-9 feed, the seconds dragged. 30 seconds, nothing but black. 45, the smoke began to shift. 75 thin strands of visibility clawed their way through the haze. Then, at 93 seconds after the first impact, the Sabalan emerged just enough. The Tomahawk corrected instantly. It punched straight through the frigate's bridge. Decades earlier, the Sabalan had survived a catastrophic hit during the Iran-Iraq War. A bomb dropped down its smokestack that should have ended it. It had been towed home, repaired, preserved. a symbol of resilience. But this time, there would be no rescue. 38 years of borrowed time ended in a single, violent second. Yet even as 2 frigates burned in the harbour, the battle was already expanding. 3 miles to the north, a massive converted vessel serving as a floating drone carrier was already launching. On the radar scope of an E-2D Hawkeye circling high above, 3 faint contacts appeared. Low, slow, barely distinguishable from background noise. Shahed 136 drones. They were already airborne. The vessel, anchored just beyond the chaos, was pushing drones off its rails as fast as boosters could cycle. One after another, they dropped, ignited, and accelerated toward the open sea. Every second it remained operational meant another drone heading toward the American fleet, positioned 30 miles offshore. The response came swiftly. 2 F A 18E Super Hornets surged northward, cutting through the sky at high altitude. Under their wings hung AGM-158C LRASM missiles, long-range autonomous hunters designed for one purpose: to find and destroy ships without guidance. At 40,000 feet, the lead pilot released. The missile dropped cleanly, then came alive. From that moment forward, it belonged to itself. No commands, no corrections, no turning back. It descended to wave-top altitude, gliding silently, its sensors listening, absorbing radar emissions, radio signals, any electronic whisper that could betray its target. Meanwhile, 3 Shahed drones closed in on the fleet. They flew low, just 50 feet above the water below the radar horizon until the final miles. Small, crude, but deadly. The combat air patrol had less than a minute. Through a forward-looking infrared system, the lead pilot spotted a faint thermal smudge against the cold ocean. A Sidewinder missile launched. For 3 agonizing seconds, it searched, then found its mark. The drone exploded mid-air. The second fell to cannon fire. The third didn't make it past the wingman. But even as the drones were eliminated, the LRASM continued its silent approach. It didn't care about exact coordinates. It hunted emissions. And when the target, a massive drone carrier, shifted slightly from its expected position, the missile adjusted without hesitation. On the MQ-9 feed, the vessel was still launching. Another drone lifted off. It never mattered. The LRASM struck first, penetrating the forward deck and detonating deep within the drone's storage bay. 30 seconds later, a second impact tore through the hull at the waterline. The ship began to fold in on itself. Within minutes, it was dying. But the drones it had already released were now someone else's problem. And, far to the east, another threat was moving. At Konarak Naval Base, Iran's flagship, the Jamaran, was preparing to enter the fight. A symbol of national pride, a centerpiece of naval power. But it had never faced anything like this. The American pilot approaching the harbor could already see the danger. Air defense systems were active far more than expected. The suppression mission had failed. There would be no clean entry. He had 60 seconds to act. The SLAM-ER missile dropped from his aircraft, wings deploying as it surged toward the harbor. Unlike other weapons, this one required guidance manual control through its final moments. He stayed, circling just beyond the reach of anti-aircraft guns. He watched the missile's camera feed fill his display. The Jamaran came into view, crew members scrambling. He adjusted aim. 3 miles. 2. 1. The warhead struck below the waterline. Inside, the explosion tore through the engine room. The ship's structure failed catastrophically. Within seconds, it began to settle, its stern sinking, its hull breaking under the stress. Iran's flagship was finished before it ever fired a shot. But the battle was far from over. Back at Bandar Abbas, another giant burned. The Makran, a converted tanker turned drone platform, was engulfed in flames but still afloat. a floating inferno loaded with fuel and potentially intact drone stockpiles. If it drifted free, it would become a moving disaster. Time was running out. Under threat from a mobile Tor missile system, American pilots pressed their attack. One dove through incoming fire, barely evading a surface-to-air missile that screamed past his cockpit. Moments later, precision bombs obliterated the launcher. Then, the Makran was struck twice. The hull ruptured. Water surged in. Fire raged above. Slowly, inevitably, the massive vessel began to die. By midday, the harbor was unrecognizable. Smoke towered thousands of feet into the sky. Warships burned. Wreckage drifted. But beyond the destruction, a new threat had already slipped away. Fast attack boats, small, agile, heavily armed, had fled into the Strait of Hormuz, weaving between civilian tankers, hiding in plain sight. They carried anti-ship missiles, and they were waiting. Helicopters hunted them. Jets strafed them. Precision strikes eliminated some, but not all. Some disappeared into the maze of islands and shallow waters, too close to civilian traffic, too dangerous to engage with larger weapons. The battlefield had shifted from open war to something far more unpredictable. Because even as the fires burned behind them, the surviving boats carried one final possibility. Not victory, but disruption. And in the narrow waters of the Strait of Hormuz, that was more than enough. That was more than enough.